Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Really a very warm welcome to all of you, in the middle of the day to come attend the seminar. On behalf of the Asia Global Institute, I'd like to really just say how happy I am to see all of you. Just a quick word of introduction about AGI. AGI is really a think tank that is part of the Hong Kong U that is dedicated to really just one concept. The concept is we're really looking at a very small number of global issues in the world. Many of these issues that we see debated are framed from a Western perspective. And that's fine, that's the way the historical, but we think it's very important to actually add a series of Asian perspectives in the plural. I don't think there is actually one Asian perspective. And AGI is dedicated to bring those issues to the global arena so we can actually have some of the global issues that we all care about framed and discussed from an Asian perspective. So we've been around for over 10 years now. The predecessor was something called the Fung Global Institute, and we're carrying on that tradition. And that tradition includes a very close relationship with the Harvard Kennedy School, and we're very happy today to welcome Dean Jeremy Weinstein, who is the Dean of the Kennedy School. It's actually a very short introduction I've been requested, but it's a very long bio, which I'm not going to read. But suffice it to say that Jeremy has had a long, distinguished career at Stanford before coming to the Kennedy School, and really now taken over the stewardship of a very important institution. I would say not just for Harvard, for America, at a very crucial time. And really, we had a very good discussion on that. And he has really focused on a lot of award-winning research on politics, on the ethics of politics, and the political economy, how you can develop it, and democracy. And today, I think he's going to tackle something that I know very little about, but I think all of us better be very aware of. All of us talk about AI. And when we talk about AI, we think about GPUs, and we think about software. But there is one aspect to AI that we don't talk about enough, and which is the ethics of AI. It's nothing to do with advancing the state of the art of AI, but now that we're where we are in the use of the AI, what are the considerations? And the ethics of AI, I think, is so much a part of what we really need to think about before we think about advancing more and more the state of the art, and let the whole thing get out of control, frankly. And I also like to say that Jeremy's presence in Hong Kong is very much appreciated as our continued dialogue with major institutions around the world, of course, like Harvard, and also for us in Hong Kong to tackle issues that are of global relevance that may be sensitive even in other jurisdictions. This is Hong Kong, and this is the role that we can play and we will play. So, Jeremy, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much for welcoming me to the Asia Global Institute and to Hong Kong. This is my first time in Hong Kong. I arrived at 4:30 a.m. this morning. I'm going to do my best to put on the strongest show possible. But it's really a thrill to be here with you and to share some of my thoughts on technology, ethics, and public policy. I'm going to start today by really sharing some thoughts that emerged for me from a book that I wrote with two colleagues, Rob Reish and Mehran Sahami, called System Error: Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. And I need to tell you a little bit about the origins of this book, because if you read about my bio, you would wonder, why is Dean Jeremy Weinstein here talking about technology, ethics, and policy? Dean Jeremy Weinstein is actually a political scientist who spent most of his career studying African politics, international relations, and US foreign policy. And it was in the context of my work in the US government, where I served most recently as deputy to the US ambassador to the United Nations under the Obama administration, when I first began to grapple in a very serious way with the disconnect between those who were making public policy at the highest levels of our government and the ways in which society was being transformed by new technologies. So when I was in a senior leadership role in the Obama administration, we were grappling with a set of frontier technologies. This was in 2014, where we were experiencing cyber attacks that were being carried out on companies based in the United States, perhaps by foreign governments, perhaps by foreign actors. And the question was, what's the appropriate response of the US government? We were grappling with new innovations like end-to-end encryption that would preserve privacy, but came at the cost of the ability, in our case, of the US government to think about addressing some of our national security and public safety needs. And so those who were responsible for the most important decisions of our time at the White House, where we would meet every day, didn't really have any deep understanding of the technological frontier. And I put myself in that category, even as someone who had taught at Stanford for 15 years before I was in this role. But I did my thing at Stanford. I wasn't focused on all that was happening around me in Silicon Valley. So when I came back to Stanford at the end of the Obama administration, and this is well before I started at the Kennedy School. I started at the Kennedy School only this July. So in 2016, I arrived back at Stanford, and Stanford had been transformed. It was a place that was now defined by computer science and engineering and the pathway to artificial intelligence. And the question was, as a social scientist and someone who cares about public policy, what is my role in that environment? And my role, I thought at that time, was to play an important role in shaping how technologists think about the social responsibility that they have as people designing the technologies of the future. So I found a political philosopher, that's my colleague Rob Reich. There are normative issues that are at play. I was the social scientist and the policymaker. And then we got this guy called Mehran Sahami, the most popular computer science professor at Stanford. And we enlisted him in an effort to reimagine how we would teach and educate the next generation of computer scientists. And we needed him not only because he's super smart, but because he helped us ensure that we were taken seriously, that we were bringing the humanities and the social sciences to bear on new technologies, but we did it by teaching in the computer science department. And the courses that we taught, first for undergraduates and then for professional engineers, led to this book. And so I want to tell you a bit about the arguments in this book. So I want to start with where we find ourselves today in 2024, the relationship between technology and the political institutions that govern our societies. And I want to start with a story about a young Stanford undergraduate. His name's Joshua Browder. He was a student around 2016, 2017, brilliant young student, comes to Stanford, and like so many Stanford undergraduates, he says, I don't know if I need a college education. What I really need is access to venture capital. And if I can access venture capital, I can start a company. And so he decided to drop out of Stanford after his first year to launch a company. So what was his company? His company was called Do Not Pay. And like so many startups that are rooted in someone's personal pain point, right? What is it that I need to solve for? Joshua Browder was solving for a really annoying problem, which is the fact that if you park in places where you're not allowed to park, you get parking tickets. And he thought that this was outrageous to be given parking tickets, and he wanted to be able to get out of paying for parking tickets. Now, he accumulated a lot of parking tickets as a high school student growing up in London, and he didn't have the means to pay for them. And he realized that actually there were some ways using tools of automation where you could contest parking tickets through computer-enabled, means, and basically get your parking tickets overturned. And he thought, great, I can turn this into a company. And he went to Sand Hill Road and he raised millions of dollars to launch this company called Do Not Pay. Got a lot of public attention. People were really excited about it. I tell you this story because what Josh Browder was solving for, the annoyance of parking tickets, missed so much about why parking tickets even exist. Okay, so one of the reasons that parking tickets exist is that we may designate particular spaces for people who need access to a building because they have a physical disability. Or we may give parking tickets because people park on a side of the street at a time when that side of the street needs to be cleaned, or it needs to be cleared of debris or snow or ice if you're in the United States. Sometimes we have restrictions on parking because we want to reduce congestion in the city center. And one of the ways that in the UK they use revenues from parking tickets is actually to rebuild their roadways. So there are all sorts of social goals that are solved for by the institution of something called a parking ticket. But a startup company that's designed to exploit holes in the system to get people out of paying for parking tickets solves for Josh Browder's problem, but it doesn't solve for society's problem. And I tell you that story because I think it's emblematic of part of what's missing in the mentality of startups. And if you think that's just a silly example, I want to tell you about the evolution of Josh Browder's ambitions for the tech sector, which is, let's not just solve for parking tickets, let's displace lawyers, right? Because who likes lawyers? Now I can say that with a smile. My wife is a lawyer. I like lawyers a lot. But many people don't like lawyers, right? And so Josh Browder is out there making the argument that the legal sector should simply be displaced by AI. And that in fact, if you need to negotiate a property dispute, if you need to negotiate a divorce, if you need to decide the fair allocation of time with your children in a divorce settlement, let's use AI instead of human beings. And I think that speaks to some of the blinders that exist in Silicon Valley. Now, this is 2016, 2017. Of course, we're now in the moment of large language models. We're in the moment of ChatGPT. We're in the moment of a set of advances that portend a disruption to major sectors of our economy and the way in which we live and operate that is far more transformative than even the prior waves of the internet that we've lived through. And so large language models first begin as a bit of an experiment. And in fact, the last chapter of my book, which came out in 2021, was about ChatGPT before any of you knew what ChatGPT was. We knew this was a couple years down the road on the horizon. And it was rolled out by OpenAI as an experiment, right? Let's see what happens if we put this out into the world. How will people use it? And let's observe the kind of social effects. The orientation of OpenAI at the outset was a learning orientation, but then what happened is it caught fire. And they said, well, let's not treat it as an experiment. Let's dominate the market as quickly as we possibly can. And that's when you begin to experience unintended consequences, like the unintended consequences of the rush to commercialize large language models to solve that really annoying problem that every kid under the age of 22 confronts, which is that you have to write. And you have to write in a classroom. And you have to write a paper on a topic that requires you to read books. And so all of a sudden, I'm raising a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old in Silicon Valley, and what I'm grappling with as a parent, as large language models are being rolled out, are things like Paragraph AI and other commercialized forms of this new technology that are designed to solve this pain point of writing. But this is then thrust on hundreds of thousands of teachers who are operating in classrooms with no ability to respond to this transformation. This change happens in real time. Now again, maybe this example feels kind of small to you, but of course, if you haven't heard the phrase P-doom, which is short for the probability of doom, right? Concerns about existential risk with respect to AI are also manifest and real. So not just maybe the annoyance of how does the education sector grapple with, content that's generated by large language models rather than people's brains and their ability to write, but we're now at a moment where people are thinking about consequences that are far greater. Ways in which, even if we don't get to artificial general intelligence, these technologies may, in important ways, so undermine normal ways of operation and engagement in society that there are real risks and substantial risks that need to be focused on and mitigated against. Now, all of this is happening, this moment of extraordinary technological change, at a moment where regulatory power is shifting. So in the bottom right-hand corner is Washington, D.C. There's been almost no regulation out of Washington, D.C. on anything related to technology since the tech sector was born. And I'm going to tell you part of the story about why. That goes back to the Clinton and Gore administration in the 1990s. So really where tech regulation is happening is in three other places. It's happening in Sacramento, California, a state with unified party control. Democrats are in the governor's office and control the state legislature. It's also where many of the major tech companies are headquartered. In Brussels, right, through the EU, in Beijing, right? These are three relevant regulatory capitals while Washington mostly watches what's happening. And what's interesting is you take a look at the frontiers of tech regulation is that both in the East and the West, people are focused on similar questions of the challenges generated by new technologies, not in AI specifically, but the tech sector. But they often have different motivations in trying to address these concerns. So for example, both in the China and the United States, you have a big focus on concentrated market power. In the US, the perspective is about how do we foster competition? How do we create an environment in which startups and small tech, as Donald Trump calls it, could actually survive, or little tech, right? China also focuses on challenges of monopoly power and control. There are also concerns about concerted political power that comes from that concentration of economic power. Likewise, we have privacy. I often show this chart to my undergraduates at Stanford before I moved to Harvard and show that the privacy law in China and the privacy law in Europe, which was called the GDPR, the Generalized Data Protection Regulation, are almost identical. A very similar framework for thinking about the privacy rights that need to be protected, different underlying motivations. Likewise, AI risk. We're now at a new moment where we're thinking about a regulatory architecture for AI risk. In the European Union, it's built around something called the precautionary principle, the idea that we should look at different kinds of technologies as they're being rolled out in terms of their potential social consequences and ascribe different levels of oversight and testing, perhaps in advance before technologies are rolled out into the world. China is beginning to think very quickly in similar ways about the challenges that AI poses when rolled out without any regulatory architecture. Now, what about the US at this moment? Where's the US going to go on tech regulation? And the answer is we don't know. Because on the one hand, J.D. Vance, the vice president, has been an enthusiast for the kind of work that Lina Khan, one of the critical regulators of the Biden administration, has done in challenging the concentration of power in large tech companies. On the other hand, one of the biggest enthusiasts of Donald Trump's run for the presidency for a second time was Mark Andreessen, one of the venture capitalists behind Andreessen Horowitz, one of the creators of Netscape and the founding architecture for the internet. And Mark Andreessen's perspective is the opposite of J.D. Vance's. It's that innovation needs to proceed in an unconstrained way. And so we have no idea where those competing viewpoints are, how they're going to play out in the context of the Trump administration. Okay, that's where we are now. Let's talk a little bit about where we came from. Okay, what got us to this moment with respect to tech regulation? So I want to start with the extraordinary aspirational motivation of technologists. And it goes back to the 1970s and the 1980s, a period of hackers, enthusiasts, optimists, who were focused on disrupting what they saw as broken market institutions and broken government institutions. And this is what gave rise to an extraordinary pace of scientific innovation and change that has transformed how all of us do everything. And it wouldn't have been possible without government, and in fact in the United States, the government played an absolutely critical role in investing upstream in R&D that gave us the iPhone, that gave us the internet, that gave us most of the technologies that we now take advantage of. This is an excerpt from Mark Andreessen's Tech Optimist Manifesto, which he put out a couple years ago, which speaks to that founding aspiration of the technologists. Our civilization was built on technology. It is built on technology. Technology is the glory of human ambition. We have glorified the advance of technology until recently. I'm here to bring you the good news. There is a superior way of living far ahead. We have the tools, the systems, and the ideas. We have the will. It's time to be techno-optimists again. So this speaks to 50 years of ambition among scientists and engineers about the way in which the advance of technology is going to improve how we live in the world. And that's still at the heart of Silicon Valley's orientation. And not just Silicon Valley, but the technologists who are now deployed all around the world. But there's another perspective. And the other perspective is to say that technology and the tech industry is like any other industry, in that the production of the market, the way in which private sector generates and can take advantage of scientific innovations to improve the human condition, is unrivaled, but it also generates externalities. And the classic externality is pollution, right? Which is that when you build a company, when you're producing something, you're producing widgets, whatever it is that you're generating in your manufacturing orientation, there are going to be things that you spit out, and you're going to spit them out into the air, and you're going to spit them out into the water. And the challenge is that in the absence of a regulatory architecture around the market, no one is going to price in those externalities. And so that is the justification in classical economics. Where's our provost who was trained at Chicago? Exactly. The classic justification that even a Chicago school economist can probably accept for some form of government intervention, right? To address the misalignment of prices. And technology is no different, because each of the new technologies that's being generated creates a set of externalities that are not solved for by the companies on their own. And so we're in a world where there's a sort of contest between technologists and the private sector that exists around technologists who want to optimize the benefits of new technology in pursuit of commercial returns. And then regulators, and regulators is just a bad word for government, right? Government is thinking, yes, we want to create the space for technological change, but we want to minimize a set of negative externalities. We want to make sure that we're solving for a set of social goals and not just for the private goals of companies. But the reality of the moment that we're in, and why we're in this challenging moment with respect to AI, is that up until quite recently, 2016, 2017, when you got the first privacy laws, so what I'd say for the first 20 years of this technological moment from the launch of the internet in the mid-1990s, we've been in a world where the regulators didn't play. The regulators' view was basically, we'll leave it to the technologists to solve for everyone. And what that meant is that we are inhabiting a world in which we have benefited from technology's extraordinary rise, but we are also carrying all of the negative externalities without intervention to address them. So why have we been in that world? And we've been in that world, we argue in the book, for 3 reasons. Okay, reason number 1 is that technology companies are rooted in engineering, and engineering is built around what one would call an optimization mindset. Even the mathematical formulations that underlie the coding of algorithms are built around the idea that you're trying to find the most clean and efficient strategy to solve for and optimize for a particular outcome. Now, there's some challenges that come up when you build a world around an optimization mindset. The first is that you might be optimizing for something that isn't a social good, right? And so if you're optimizing, for example, for large-scale human destruction, we might ask ourselves the question, is that a good social outcome? Right? And of course, we've confronted those challenges with nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons was optimizing for that kind of level of human destruction, and then we had to build an architecture around it to constrain its use. A second challenge of the optimization mindset is, especially in a world of quantification, you have to find proxies for the outcome that you care about if you're designing algorithmic orientations to optimization. So Facebook's ultimate goal is to foster human connection, but the proxy for human connection is time spent on the Facebook platform. And do we think human connection and time spent on Facebook are one and the same? Well, I can tell you from watching my kids use their technology, they are not one and the same. Right? Human connection that I experienced as a young person is entirely different than what it is that people get from time spent on a platform. But you can understand why time spent on the Facebook platform serves the bottom line of Facebook, even if it doesn't achieve a social goal that we might agree with. Third challenge, and by far the hardest, and the philosophers in this room can appreciate this, is that most of the decisions that we make in the world involve competing values that are in tension with one another. And so when you're an optimizer, you're solving for one goal, but you're not thinking about these competing goals and how best to solve across them. One good example to give you on this front is Signal. If you have Signal on your phone, an application, it's designed to optimize for privacy. It's an extraordinary powerful application that optimizes for privacy. But privacy may not be the only thing we care about in society, especially if we're concerned about illegal behavior, right? And so the challenge of multiple valuable goals are inherent in every new technological design. What are we solving for, and what might we be leaving on the table? Where might there be a negative externality that needs to be addressed? So that's problem number one, which is the optimization mindset that is driving technological change is one that helps to create these externalities. Second problem or challenge really comes from the model that finances new technology, which is venture capital. Now, I'm from Silicon Valley. I have to be an enthusiast for venture capital. It's part of the passport of originally being from Silicon Valley. And the model of venture capital is extraordinary in the sense that people were willing to allocate capital to startup ventures where in fact you don't even know what they're going to build. Maybe you have a sense of who the founders are, but you're going to make these early stage bets that have really greased the wheels for dramatic technological change. But the model of venture capital is very much like a lottery in the sense that of all the investments that you make, you need one investment to take off in such a way that it pays back all of the investments that you made that failed. And it's going to be some tiny share of your portfolio that pays for everything else and generates outsized returns. So how do you get that outsized return? Well, you get it by scaling quickly whatever technology is taking off, regardless of the social consequences. So think back to the story I told you about ChatGPT, where it was rolled out as an experiment, but when it took off like wildfire, everyone realized this was the moment for market dominance. And then you try and find ways of locking in your market dominance. And that's why we have so much concentrated power in the tech sector. And it serves in part to realize the outsized return that the venture capital sector needs to stay afloat. Okay, optimization mindset problem number one, venture capital model scales these technologies so quickly that the negative externalities can't be addressed. And then the third part of the challenge for why we are where we are now is that up until recently, from the central regulatory capital of the world with respect to technology, which is Washington, D.C., regulatory indifference was strongly bipartisan. That is the view dating back to the Clinton-Gore administration, through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, up through the present, was that the best strategy for Washington was to craft what was called a regulatory oasis around technology. Clinton said this was paving the pathway to the information superhighway. And what that meant is that the kinds of regulatory constraints that Washington would often build around private markets were not built around the tech sector. And all sorts of good things came from that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not against technological change. I benefit from it every day. But the orientation towards Washington was to put the direction of technological change entirely in the hands of technologists and to absent our public institutions from this challenge of figuring out how to resolve these externalities and solve for the social whole. And so that brings us back to this present moment. And part of what I want to tell you is the AI moment is nothing new. It's the same dynamic playing out all over again. Because we can think about it with respect to privacy and the erosion of privacy that emerged as the internet was created and search engines which are free because you are providing your data to them for free, right? There is a deal, there is an exchange in every free application you use that is harnessing your private information to sell advertising or accomplish some other goal. The reality and ways in which social media companies have undermined notions of truth and access to high quality information that's key to the functioning of public institutions. These are all externalities of technology. The ways in which the massive use of algorithms to make all sorts of consequential decisions, from the allocation of healthcare to the hiring of people into companies to making decisions about who gets loans, are embedded with discrimination that's rooted in history in ways that aren't even visible to those who are affected. And then, of course, often talked about the shocks to the labor market that come from automation, now from AI, and who's responsible for addressing that disruption? Who's responsible for the upskilling? Who's responsible for ensuring that people can benefit as technologies change? So that's the world we're in. The world we're in is one where each new technology that gets rolled out is something that transforms how we live, but it generates a set of negative externalities that go largely unaddressed. Because we've left decision-making about the advance of technological change to the technologists. They're driven by optimization, they're fueled by venture capital, and public institutions have largely retreated from view. Okay, where do we go from here? What I have tried to emphasize in my teaching over so many years with thousands of young technologists is that technology is not something that happens to us. It's not something that washes over us like a wave, and you kind of take it or leave it. In fact, technology, the progress of technological change, is something that we get to shape, right? It's a human invention, right? And there are lots of ways in which we can shape it. You can shape it if you build technologies. You can shape it if you are a financier of technologies. You can shape it if you exist in the public institutions that oversee the market. You can shape it if you are someone who votes in a society and can exercise your influence through your political preferences. You can also affect technology through the technologies you choose to use and not use. And so we actually have extraordinary agency with respect to technological change, even though we act as if it's something that just acts upon us. Now, you'll often find that at moments where people are dissatisfied with technological change, that this is the answer that's rolled out. Like, if you don't like Facebook, get off Facebook. So this is a tweet back when it was Twitter from Brian Acton, who was the founder of WhatsApp. WhatsApp got bought by Facebook. He was pretty frustrated with Facebook. He wanted to get out, and he said, it's time to delete Facebook. Same thing happened with Uber. This happens with each of the technology companies. But here's the problem. This is not a solution to externalities. Just by exiting yourself from Facebook, you're still living in a society where if Facebook and other social media platforms are used to undermine notions of truth, to profit off of misinformation around a pandemic, around an election, you still experience those effects whether you have Facebook on your phone or not. So this as a solution to negative externalities is insufficient. So what you really need are systemic solutions. Why do I have a picture of a roadway? Because this is not our first time at the rodeo. We roll out new technologies all the time, over hundreds and hundreds of years of human existence. A really important technology that we rolled out was the automobile, right? The automobile was transformative for human existence. It enabled people to move almost effortlessly from one place to another, to live in different places from where they worked, to live in different places from where they grew up, and to have that accessibility at a relatively low cost. But as a parent of a teenager, I also know that automobiles are a weapon. And they're a weapon that can cause a lot of harm. And so we didn't approach this new technology of driving and say, decide how fast you want to drive. You want to drive 100 miles an hour or 200 kilometers an hour? Have your way. We didn't say, if you're driving by a school and you want to press on the accelerator, press on the accelerator, right? We built a set of guardrails around this new technology that enabled us to benefit from it while also solving for other social goals. And the tech sector needs that. Not just the AI moment, right? AI is just the most current version of this. We need these kind of systemic solutions and guardrails. So I'm going to end with a couple thoughts on where those guardrails come from, and then we'll open up to some questions. The first place I want to start on the so what do we do about this, is really about the responsibility of technologists themselves. Because there is always going to be a race between technological change and the ability of political institutions to respond. Political institutions are always playing from behind. And so the pace of technological change and the ability of the market to pursue scientific frontiers and to begin to turn them into something that we benefit from is always going to happen faster than political institutions of any kind can respond to. Which means that you actually need an ethic of responsibility among those who wield this extraordinary power. And ethics of responsibility don't necessarily require laws. They require norms. They require a set of moral commitments. They require an orientation towards thinking not only about your customers, not only about your shareholders, but the stakeholders that make the market work, that make society function effectively. And if you think about something like the medical profession, where a couple hundred years ago you could go to a town fair and you could get a tonic, and someone would give you a tonic and they'd say, this tonic will solve your problem. And you would drink it and it might solve your problem or it might kill you. And you really couldn't know the difference. And we had this kind of absence of responsibility for those who were the purveyors of solutions to problems of human health. We've gone through 200 years of building an architecture around healers, right? But that architecture maybe ends with something called the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, but it begins with ethics of responsibility among people who are in the healing profession. And you don't have such a thing in computer science. And why don't you have it? Well, let's remember, computer science is brand new. There were no computer science departments in universities before the 1970s. This is a transformative moment, and we need to be in a position of building this ethic of responsibility, just as, for example, we've seen around the other transformative technology of the moment, which is gene editing and CRISPR. That comes along in a highly architected system of norms and standards, the life sciences, where all of a sudden, from the moment it's invented, it has an architecture and ethic of responsibility, whereas in computer science, you have no parallel to that. Second, you need industry to begin to engage in self-regulation. So not just the actions of individual engineers who are on the line building code deep in the stack. This is the example of White House voluntary commitments that were negotiated with major AI companies around safety, security, and trustworthy AI. These are Microsoft's commitments, for example. But this effort of large technology companies, not because they're going to be regulated, but because they understand the risks and recognizing that they're on the frontiers to begin to solve for things that go beyond their bottom line. We also need to grapple with these issues of concentrated power. This is one of those areas where I said there's overlap between the perspective in the East and the perspective in the West, that ultimately the concentration of power in a small number of technology companies is undermining a lot of broader goals. And I'll just end with two final thoughts. Perhaps the hardest work we need to do, and part of why I'm so excited to be the new dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, is that we need to design public institutions that are capable of governing our technological future. In the United States, where we have a massive federal civil service, we haven't reformed our federal civil service laws since the 1970s. Imagine running a company where you hadn't changed your HR system since the 1970s. You hadn't changed your pay scales. You hadn't changed your job descriptions. You hadn't changed your talent pipeline. That's what our public institutions look like in the United States. DCIT is a model in the UK where they've attempted to reimagine their public institutions to govern technological change, both to use AI to solve public problems, but also to exercise regulatory oversight. Singapore has an extraordinary model on this front as well. There's real work to be done in thinking about how we design public institutions for this moment. And we also need to do that effort to solve for our social challenges and our political challenges in a way that is collaborative. And that is a real challenge at the political moment that we find ourselves in. So we have the Secretary General driving a conversation at the United Nations about governing AI for humanity. This last week in San Francisco, we had the first meeting of an international network for AI safety, all of the major governmental organizations, but you can see from a subset of countries, meeting to talk about how we coordinate model testing and safety testing on these large AI models. We're going to need to build an architecture for this moment of technological change that solves not only country by country, but also globally for some of the risks that we confront. And you could see from the most recent communique when the leadership of China and the United States came together that one commitment that was made, which was no use of nuclear weapons without human decision makers. Major consequential public commitment. It speaks to the work that needs to be done to build that framework for global collaboration. So that's system error. I hope I provoked you with some of these opening comments. I'm happy to take some questions, and thank you so much for having me.
There was a wonderful presentation, Dean Weinstein. I learned so much about AI. I'm not an expert, I have to admit, but I have the privilege to ask you the first two questions because I'm the director of the Asia Global Institute. But I'm going to open the floor to the experts who really know much about AI and AI ethics. Thank you for writing such a wonderful book. As Victor said, people like to talk about the hardware, the software, the technologies. People have been concerned about the ethical issues arising from the AI revolution. Let me ask you the first question, which is the transformation of the so-called regulatory oasis that you mentioned, started by the Clinton administration and then continue until the Obama administration. What was the turning point that you think triggered such a change in the sort of regulatory mindset that the US government finally realized that in addition to sort of regulating monopolies, they also have to start thinking about, whether there's some political consequence or ethical consequences arising from, the AI development?
So I think the first thing I'd say is that the U.S. is far behind. The biggest shifts in orientation. Is this on?
Yeah.
I don't think it's on. The biggest shifts in the regulatory architecture have come not from the United States, but first and foremost from the European Union, and second from Sacramento, California, which is surprising. It's, the US is decentralized, states can operate, but, the first moves were really around privacy. Generalized data protection regulation, 2015, 2016, China then adopts its privacy law, Sacramento follows suit, adopts its own privacy law. All three of those privacy laws have most of the same major characteristics. I think that responds to a moment where people are recognizing that the amount of information that is available on them by virtue of the use of a set of applications in the internet age is so extraordinary, it represents a deep violation of an orientation towards privacy that they believed was protected. And I think what's so interesting about the United States is that in the United States, there are so many restrictions on government access to data about people as individuals, and almost no restrictions on private sector access to data about people as individuals. And so people begin to grapple with this reality, and you get this momentum towards privacy legislation that really begins in the European Union. But I think it's important to say that the US still doesn't have a national privacy law. So most countries around the world now have national privacy regulators, now have architectures with respect to private information that give you the right to know what information is being collected about you, to have that information deleted, to prevent its transfer to unauthorized third parties without your permission. These are things that are still not protected in the United States. So you don't get a real pivot on that. You also don't get a real pivot on the moderation of content on social media platforms in the United States either. One of the aspects of the United States that makes it distinct is it has the most robust free speech protections of any country in the world. And that's not just a function of being a democracy. It's the case that democracies vary enormously in the extent to which free speech is protected. But the free speech protections of the United States are so robust that even concerns about the promotion of content online and misinformation and the undermining of democratic institutions, even that doesn't lead after the 2016 election to any meaningful change in the United States because free speech is so prioritized in the United States that even as, for example, the Europeans, where there are hate speech laws on the books and particular kinds of content that can't be promoted, for example, Germany, content that denies the Holocaust, social media companies have to take that down or else they're fined. You don't have anything like that in the United States. So what happens in the United States around content regulation is all in the self-regulation space. It's things like the Facebook Oversight Board or the community standards that Twitter had that are basically self-governing mechanisms. So the only place in the United States that you've really seen the shift away from the regulatory oasis so far is around antitrust. And that really didn't happen until the Biden administration and the appointment of Jonathan Cantor at DOJ and Lena Khan, where an intellectual argument was gaining force that the concentrated power of these companies was so significant that it was undermining people's ability to realize their own preferences through private market behavior, and for startup companies to even compete. AI only makes that challenge worse given the need for compute, the kinds of resources and access to data that are required. And so that's the one piece of the puzzle that has really moved forward. But I think it's important to note that it has moved forward in part because it didn't require new legislation. Everything else that I was talking about would have required legislation. And so in a polarized Washington, D.C., where virtually no bipartisan legislation has been possible over the last 6 to 8 years, you could only make progress on the aspect of tech that didn't require bipartisan cooperation, that could be carried out by a political party with executive power on its own, which was in the antitrust space.
Great. Let me ask another question, which is about optimization. So when you mentioned that one of the fundamental problems for why sort of AI has created all these sort of ethical social issues is because the technologists are all like Victor and I, who are economists. And we like to find the optimal solution. And then you said because the objective was set privately, individually by companies who just want to pursue either profit or try to be more innovative. But then the question is, at the social level, who should be responsible for setting the objective? Right. I like the fact that at Harvard or at the more international level, people started talking about coming up with a common shared goal to hopefully create some sort of balance between private incentives and social goods. But then ultimately, in different countries, how do you see that this sort of social objective is going to be figured out?
I love this question. And part of the reason I love this question is this is the question that I always ask the technologists. As I've been training young computer scientists and professional engineers, and we'll talk about something, for example, like fairness and discrimination and algorithms. And I'll ask people to define fairness. And actually there are like 26 mathematically distinct definitions of fairness. There's a great paper on this. So fairness, something that we all think we know what it is, actually is quite complex to define mathematically. And so if you're designing an algorithm and you're trying to solve for fairness, and so I work this through a technologist and I say, well, which definition of fairness do we pick? And they say, I don't know. I say, well, how are you going to figure it out in your company? They say, I'm going to call the legal counsel. Right? I'm going to call general counsel because they'll tell me which definition of fairness I have to pick. Right? But we can go beyond that and say, well, should it be picked by your general counsel? Say there is no definition of fairness that's legislated, then which definition of fairness are you going to use? The answer is, well, experts should pick it. So then you say, which experts? And then they say, well, people who know a lot about this. I said, who's going to pick the experts? And then they might say, well, government. Okay, well, which part of government? Is the governor going to pick the experts or the president? So it takes you down this path, as you rightly point out, of where do we solve for our social goals, right? And I think you're the economist, I'm the political scientist, and so it wouldn't be surprising to you to hear me say that politics is where we solve for social goals. And we solve for social goals through politics. Politics is the study, but also the reality of people with diverse and divergent preferences living together and trying to achieve social outcomes without killing one another. That's the fundamental enterprise of order. And in the United States, we solve for those social problems through democracy. That's the set of political institutions that we've designed, the rules that we've created. I describe democracy as one of the most ancient technologies because it solves this really important problem of enabling people who don't agree with one another to live together and to live together peacefully, to make investments in land and realize those investments, to cooperate for mutual exchange under a set of rules, and to express their preferences and have a set of rules that enable you to say, you know what, I didn't get my preferences, but it was kind of a fair process. And so I'm going to go along with this, and there might be some change in the future that better reflects my preferences. Of course, lots of societies solve political problems in different ways with different rules. And when you have a social consensus on how you solve those political problems, that is the locus that is separate from companies and separate from the market for taking these negative externalities and deciding to what extent they need to be addressed.
Wonderful. I was going to ask two questions, but I cannot resist from asking the last one. And I bet you answered these questions a million times before, which is the impact of AI on jobs and therefore on education.
Yeah.
Let me be a bit more provocative. I remember your colleague, Lauren Summers, once said in a public conference in Aspen, and then the interviewer asked him, what should we do to our kids? And then the first response by Professor Summers is, he regretted telling his grandkids 10 years ago to learn coding because he said coding is completely irrelevant today. And then the interviewer asked him, so what would you tell your next grandkid if you have a chance? And then he said, I would educate him or her to do more collective performance. So this is sort of the context, the background, without getting into a debate between you and him who is not here. I just want to see what is your view about the future of education and jobs, with AI completely displacing a lot of jobs in the near future.
So I think we as societies have lived through different waves of technological change, and at each moment of technological change, and of course you can read about this in Daron Acemoglu's book with Simon Johnson. He just won the Nobel Prize in Economics, so this is a terrific book, a 1,000-year history of technological change. There are always significant fears about labor displacement, and labor displacement is real, right? It takes time for people to adjust. Now, the positive view is that there is going to be adjustment because certain repetitive tasks are automated away. Lots of things that our grandparents and great-grandparents had to do, we don't have to do anymore because we've solved for that technologically. And then new tasks and new responsibilities get created. I'd say a couple things about that. The first is that transition takes time. And because it takes time, those of us who are thinking about social goals need to solve for the transition dynamics. And the transition dynamics might unfold over decades, right? And in the United States, this means thinking about upskilling. This means thinking about particular regions of the country that have experienced the most negative consequences of globalization. What are the next set of jobs and what are the skills that you need to train for? And that kind of dislocation is a social problem, right? Because ultimately it's associated with all sorts of social ills. It's associated with, many would say, the authoritarian turn in our politics, the fail to address that dislocation. So the kind of shocks to the labor market that unfolded because of globalization, we're going to experience some new version of that related to AI. And we can look at the last 10, 15 years and think about the consequences if they go unaddressed. So policymakers need to be thinking about those consequences and investing in kind of both redistributed support and upskilling. But I want to make a second comment, which is I agree with Larry on this point about training for coding was exactly the wrong strategy. Stanford's computer science curriculum for the first couple years is no longer relevant. It can all be done in an automated way, far more cleanly and efficiently than the students would have learned. So what we're solving for in the future is what human beings can uniquely bring to their interaction with AI and with one another. And the question is how you train for that. And that's going to mean not holding AI at arm's length and saying, actually, we don't want anyone engaging with AI as they think or write or research or anything like that. Because the reality is we are going to engage with AI. It's going to solve efforts to summarize literature. It's going to, solve writing memos. It's going to solve, it can produce slide decks. We did something at a faculty meeting earlier in the year where, just to show people the power of generative AI, we had them upload slide decks from recent presentations that they'd given for class, and to ask a generative AI tool, if I were to make this lecture 15 minutes longer and add a couple additional topics to this lecture, what would the slides look like? And it was remarkable what was added and how on point what was added is, because these models are trained on the totality of human knowledge to the extent, setting aside copyright, that's been able to be pulled into the training models. And so these are tools that are going to be helpful. The question is, how do we train and support the development of human capabilities to engage AI tools and to realize and support the skills that are required for the human-to-human interactions that can't be automated away. And that is going to require some dramatic rethinking about what happens in higher education.
Great. Thank you. Let us open up for questions. Brian, Casey, Brian first, and then a microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dean Jeremy. I'm a. Oh, sorry.
I know you're out, but we are recording.
Thank you, Dean Jeremy. I'm a moral and political philosopher working on AI governance and alignment issues, impacts on employment, so on and so forth, drawing upon ancient Greek and Confucian philosophy. And we've got a booming AI governance space at HKU, thanks to our leadership. My question concerns what you said about regulation, because you painted a picture where there's a binary between those who are pro-regulation and those who are, optimists at heart. My concern, though, lies with individuals who are techno-optimists or techno-anarchists, masquerading as pro-regulation as a means of basically co-opting regulatory structures to maintain and prop up their monopoly. I'm not going to name names, but I do think Sam Altman's pretty... that is a name, so there we go. Sam Altman advocated, AI regulation, safety, and was preaching it non-stop last year. But there were allegations that Sam was doing this as a means of bolstering OpenAI's stronghold and chokehold over cutting-edge AI research, especially those directed towards ASI and AGI. So to what extent do you fear the possibility of regulatory structures being co-opted by private entrepreneurs and firms to justify and advance their own agenda in name of safety, whereas in practice it's just a means to pump up the stock prices? So that's my question for you. Thank you very much.
Sure. Clearly you fear that outcome. And I think you're right to fear that outcome. But even before I get to that point, I'd say that it's important to recognize that those who are behind this moment of extraordinary technological change also legitimately fear some of the consequences of what they have unleashed. It's sort of ironic that the movie Oppenheimer comes out at this moment of AI and the AI arms race and the move towards artificial general intelligence. And, a set of people are walking around Silicon Valley thinking, am I the next Oppenheimer? Have I unleashed a set of steps that are going to unfold in the world where people look back on me and don't think positively about my contribution to the world, but point to me as someone who helped to drive the world towards destruction? And so I think there is a legitimate and genuine fear. That's why I put up the picture of P-Doom, the existential risk communities, because the existential risk communities are real. They're deeply rooted in Silicon Valley. I'd also say that as straight up political strategy, separate and apart from your concern about regulatory capture, I think it's been extremely good political strategy for all the major AI companies to call on the government to regulate them. And I think it's in part good strategy because they know that Washington is going to be incapable of regulating them. So to be seen to be calling for regulatory guardrails and oversight is just straight good politics. And we've seen previous versions of this, because Mark Zuckerberg, at a moment when all of the sort of concerns about misinformation and electoral manipulation happening on the Facebook platform, said, government, come regulate. content. But of course, he knew government couldn't regulate content because of free speech protections in the United States. So I think there's an even less sinister view, which is just like, this is straight good politics. But then, of course, there's the view that you articulated, and said, you know, whatever we think of Sam Altman or other leaders of this technological moment, if you think about, and we're at a place where East and West are coming together, as you framed at the outset. So from the Western perspective, thinking about our regulatory architectures are deeply shaped by the way in which large corporations exercise influence and the role of money in our politics. And so it is, of course, no surprise that you watched as the election unfolded, Silicon Valley quickly aligned behind Donald Trump when Joe Biden was running 8 points behind in the polls. Then Joe Biden steps aside, Kamala Harris is running. All of a sudden, Silicon Valley rethinks its positioning, and all this money moves quickly to Kamala Harris, and she raises, you know, $1.5 billion in 2.5 days. And so money in politics matters a lot in the United States. And the way in which our regulatory structure works is deeply shaped by corporate influence, because corporate influence is able to organize itself to take advantage of open regulatory processes to express its preferences. And so I think it's a natural view that the regulatory architecture that exists in the United States will be one that's prone to corporate influence. But then the challenge is to think about, and I could put the question back to you, what is the other version? And the other version quickly moves in the direction of something we call technocracy or expertise. And that then brings us to the question of, well, who appoints the technocrats, right? And who are the technocrats actually accountable to? And at least the virtue of our open regulatory structure is that there are a bunch of people in Congress saying the regulatory architecture is captured. Look, here are the best examples. Here's what the alternative could be. And that gets much harder in a technocracy. But a technocracy looks a lot like Plato's Philosopher Kings.
Elon Musk is a director of efficiency. He's
Right.
going to appoint himself as a technocrat, the chief technocrat in the government. Just kidding. Casey.
Hi, thank you. Casey Kwok, I'm also an economist by background. Talking about regulation versus innovation, particularly in a new sector, you know, there's a lot of debate how much regulation you should regulate in when you are exploring the unknown. The Europeans put more emphasis on regulation for a long time. The Americans do not do very much. With the result today, all the major tech companies are Americans. And the European innovators actually moved also to the US. With also the result that the global stock market is now dominated by the US. And all these technological developments, the venture capital industry and so forth, has allowed the American economy to the best performing economy as compared to the rest of the world. So how do you square your ideas about regulation and all this global competition in an industry that the future is basically unknown?
Yeah. So I said earlier in my remarks, and I want to repeat it again, I'm not a Luddite. I'm someone who believes in the possibility of technological change. I have seen how transformative it can be for so many things that I care about. And in fact, as I said earlier on, the decision to craft a regulatory oasis around big tech in the mid-1990s by the Clinton-Gore administration was probably a stroke of brilliance, right? A stroke of brilliance that enabled the development, you know, of information services, the privatization of the internet, all of the things that led to the iPhone, mobile, etc. All of this started with government R&D funding, often coming out of the Department of Defense, turned it loose into the private sector and put us on this pathway with venture capital towards dramatic change. So I'm a true believer in what technology itself can generate. I think what I don't accept is the view that you either regulate technology out of existence or you allow technologists to pursue whatever ends that they care about. I don't think it's an either or. It's a question about smart rulemaking. Can our political institutions produce smart rules? I don't know. That's a challenge. That's why I lifted up this important, you know, responsibility to design regulatory institutions that can be deeply tied to the technological frontier. Government is always going to be behind in solving for the most significant externalities. But I think if I asked you, is America a life sciences innovator? Would your answer be no? I bet your answer would be yes, right? If we look at where patents exist, if we look at where the most productive research labs are, you'd say America's a life sciences innovator. And what I'd say to you is the regulatory architecture around life sciences in the United States looks like the AI safety architecture that the EU has set up for AI. So I think it's a false argument. I think it's an argument that has largely served the interests of technology companies. I think there are lots of reasons that Europe doesn't have, a booming tech sector, but pinning it all on a regulatory architecture that basically only started in 2016 with GDPR just doesn't make sense. There are lots of reasons. Like Europe has a system of regulated capitalism and social market economies, social democratic states that's so different than the US. The university system is so different. You don't have the same investments in R&D. You don't have the same capital ecosystem. So I wouldn't pin it all on regulation. And I'd say we know that innovation and regulation can coexist. That's what's generated the most dramatic changes in human health that we've seen over 1,000 years of human history. And that existed with a regulatory architecture, not without one.
Let us take a question from over there, and then Victor.
Well, thank you very much indeed for these inspiring insights. I'd like to follow up on your early reference to politics. Now, with the upcoming Trump administration, how optimistic are you with your idea of creating the ethic of responsibility?
A good social scientist knows that prediction is not one of the things that we are particularly well suited to do. I think this is, as I described with the sort of representation of Lena Khan on the one side and Mark Andreessen on the other side, I don't know what's going to happen in this next administration. There's something important. There's an important piece of the regulatory architecture called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And for those of you who are kind of nerds in the tech space, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like 10 words in a piece of legislation that has enabled the internet and social media companies to emerge. It basically shields them from legal liability for any user-generated content. Donald Trump has hated Section 230 for years and has threatened via Twitter at multiple times to get rid of Section 230. That would be the most sweeping change in the internet landscape you could possibly imagine. Is he going to do it? I don't know whether he's going to do it. Are we going to be driven by Elon Musk's orientation to the tech architecture or JD Vance's orientation to the tech architecture? I can't predict. I can't know. I think what I do hope is that the work that's been done over the last 10 years, which really isn't work in government, it's work among people like Jeff Hinton, who won the Nobel Prize this year in physics, who, a leading AI researcher, we had 2 computer scientists win the physics prize this year, but who's at the forefront of thinking about things like AI safety and ethics, that companies are taking seriously their responsibility. Anthropic, which differentiates itself from its peers by its unwillingness to just put models out into the market without having done the kind of testing that's required, that we're getting a sort of a self-regulating dynamic that may insulate us somewhat from continued regulatory indifference from Washington. But I really can't know what's going to happen in Washington. And I guess maybe the most important thing to say, going back to some of my slides, is that Washington isn't the regulatory capital that's most important right now. It's Beijing, it's Sacramento, it's Brussels. And because the companies that engage in the tech space are global, they can't be attentive to only what happens in Washington. And so efforts to align some of these regulatory efforts, especially around existential risks, will matter for US companies, even if Washington is unengaged.
Good point. Victor?
Jeremy, thank you so much for framing the issue in such a powerful way. I think this is a fundamental issue of technology and society in the future that you really helped us just really frame it. I was just wondering about this. If we keep thinking about regulation and as a way to kind of deal with the problem, I'm just wondering whether we will be forever behind the 8 ball. You know, you yourself said regulation is always slower than this. And I'm just thinking back to how many fortunes have been made in technology, outside technology, with what people would call regulation arbitrage.
Yeah.
That'll go on forever. If you so I just wonder whether the solution doesn't lie so much just on regulation. Obviously, you need to do that as much as possible, but at the root.
Yeah.
Which means that when you educate our scientists, you've got to educate them with a good measure of ethics and these care for society. You've got to get it at the root, and not after it's all happening and then you're trying to kind of contain it and regulate it. And then that leads me to think that now from other societies, there may be some very strong societal norms and that would actually put constraints on what any person would want to do. And that really brings up what we're all about in AGI, which is if we frame this whole issue from an Asian perspective, you know, how would the whole thing look like?
Yeah.
You know, I'm just wondering whether you could comment a little bit on, you know, getting it at the root.
Yeah.
And in the education system early in a person's educational career.
I think you're exactly right. And this is why my first point, when I talked about what to do, was about cultivating an ethic of responsibility among technologists. I think the pace at which change happens means that the regulators are always going to be a decade or 20 years behind. We should still have better regulators, but we actually need the thinking to happen among the computer scientists, among the technologists, and inside the companies. So the question then is, how does that happen? Well, it goes back to the education system. Why was I teaching computer scientists at Stanford? Well, I worried that if I didn't teach them, they'd never learn philosophy. They'd never learn how to engage around normative questions. They'd never learn how to deal with questions that don't have a right or wrong answer, which is basically most of the important questions in the world. And so I needed to go teach them because they were on a narrow technical track. So if you think about all the enthusiasm for STEM education or STEAM education or whatever your favorite acronym is, if that enthusiasm is closing off for our young people the ability to grapple with the most ancient questions that human beings have had to entertain, like, what does it mean to lead a good life? What does it mean to govern a society well, right? How should we treat one another? These are all fundamental normative questions. And students that are well educated in a well-rounded way, with an understanding about how those issues have debated over time, might engage differently in a setting that I'll just describe to you, where a group of engineers are in a room and Siri is being designed, and people are discussing whether Siri should automatically turn on and gather data that would enable the company to develop a more powerful application. And no one speaks up and says, you know what? That's a terrible idea. So I think you're exactly right. It begins in the education system, but then it begins also in companies creating the space for these normative questions to be raised. There's a shorthand in Silicon Valley for people who raise concerns like this in a company. They're called red lights. You don't want to be a red light. If you want to get promoted, you want to be a green light. I mean, you don't even want to have a speed limit attached to you if you want to get promoted. So to be a red light, the kind of person who, when you're on a team, is called a red light behind your back, is a disaster. So, you know, I am not so optimistic as to think that companies, in the absence of regulatory pressure, are going to realign incentives in this way. But I go back to the example of CRISPR and gene editing, and if you haven't read Walter Isaacson's book about Jennifer Doudna, the creator of the gene editing technology at Berkeley, I encourage you to read it. She develops this technology and she has a dream. And in the dream, someone comes to knock on her office door at the University of California, Berkeley, and it's Hitler. And Hitler says, this gene editing technology that you've created, it's extraordinary. I can think about so many potential uses for this technology. And Jennifer Doudna is sweating, thinking, what have I done? What am I responsible for in the world? And on the basis of that, begins to organize the scientific community to police the use of CRISPR. Didn't require government, it didn't require a law, it didn't require a new regulatory architecture. It took a notion of personal responsibility to a civic whole that you're describing. But a natural scientist comes up in a community that is self-regulating in a way that a computer scientist does not. There's no licensure for computer scientists. There's very weak codes of ethics that are brand new with no enforcement mechanisms. And so the infancy of the computer science field also stands in the way of the kind of self-regulation that you described.
Let us take one last question because we only have 4 minutes left.
Thank you.
Please,
Thank you. Hello, I represent a Box Tribute, a tech for good NGO that works on humanitarian issues. And I wanted to talk to you about what you said about ethics for technologists. Within the technology community, I would say there is a group of technologists that exists outside the venture capital and, issues, who are working on principle development and things to that effect. I speak of the open source community and also the digital public goods initiatives who are working with the UN and other agencies to try and solve for these types of issues. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about where you see the potential of those sorts of communities to be harnessed and also to deal with some of the issues you've raised in this presentation.
Thank you so much for raising that. I always saw one of my enterprises in teaching Stanford undergraduates before I moved to Harvard as trying to help people think about what problems were worth solving. And I'd use examples of really smart young technologists solving problems that weren't important, and I would contrast them with work of the communities that you described, trying to take these technological tools and put them to work for things that are fundamentally important for humanity. I give the example of this company called Swimply. Swimply is a company that was set up to enable people to rent other people's swimming pools for an hour. Because it might be really hot and you don't have a swimming pool, and so most people are not using their swimming pool full time, and so if you can rent out your swimming pool in 15-minute increments or an hour, you can make money on the pool. I said, okay, I understand that for some people they want to get in the swimming pool, but what about people who don't have access to electricity all around the world? People don't have access to clean water, people who can't get access to medicines even though they're available in the capital but they're not in the rural area, people who don't have access to the technologies that enable people to realize high agricultural yields from the appropriate dosage of fertilizer. These are all things where technology has a role to play, but we're designing for pool rentals. And so you're absolutely right. I've painted technologists with a broad brush, and in fact, in the book, we contrast the story of Josh Browder that I started with the story of civic technologists, people who approached this moment of technological change and thought, how do we solve, for social problems more broadly? That was one of the founding motivations. And in fact, even when we think about the initial social media moment, the social media moment was about social media breaking down monopoly control over who has voice, right? Who gets to share news, who gets to be heard in society. And all of a sudden, an individual can broadcast their voice to millions. Whereas in the old days in the United States, it was 3 broadcast networks and they all decided what the news was and who heard from them. So there was this democratizing aspect of technology. And you're right that movement still exists. And that movement is going to be extremely important. And I want to drive more people into that movement. Because ultimately, making progress on the problems that so many of us care about is not going to come from regulating large tech companies. It's going to come from people taking the skills of the 21st century and putting them to work to solve the most important problems of the moment. And that's what we need to create. That's what open source represents. That's what civic tech represents. That's what digital public goods are all about. And we need that kind of engagement. I think what I found is challenging is that the financial pull of the large tech companies is so significant Not only realizing these outsized returns, being around incredibly smart people, having access to unlimited compute power and the best tech, but that exists in every sector. I mean, that is the challenge of attracting people to work on public problems. The great thing is that my job as Dean of the Kennedy School is I get to go and try and find people who want to work on public problems. And I want to make sure they do it taking advantage of the most important new technologies of the day.
Thank you so much, Dean Weinstein, for the wonderful sharing. Good luck to your initiative to harness a group of people to work on technologies and make it useful for society, but also for humanity. And we also have a broad set of questions to think about for dinner and tonight. This is a truly inspiring talk. Thank you so much.